Part 3 of Mechanica by Aristotle, translated by Edward Forster. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Geoffrey Edwards. Chapter 24. There is a question why a large circle traces out a path equal to that of a smaller circle when they are placed about the same center, but when they are rolled separately, their paths are to one another in the proportion of their dimensions. Footnote: 4 cases are considered. 1. When the 2 circles are rolled along a horizontal plane independently. 2. When they are fixed together and rolled along a plane, eta, kappa, the tangent to the small circle. 3. When they are fixed together and rolled along a plane, zeta, lambda, the tangent to the larger circle. 4. When they have the same center or axle, but move independently. Cases 2 and 3 are referred to here. End footnote. And further, the center of both being one and the same, at one time the path which they trace is of the same length as the smaller traces out alone, and at another time of the length which the larger circle traces. Now it is manifest that the larger circle traces out the longer path, for by mere observation it is plain that the angle which the circumference of each makes with its own diameter is greater in the case of the larger circle than in the smaller, so that by observation the paths along which they roll will have this same proportion to one another. But, in fact, it is manifest that when they are situated about the same center, this is not so, but they trace out an equal path, so that it comes to this, that in the one case the path is equal to that traced by the larger circle, in the other to that traced by the smaller. Let delta, zeta, gamma be the greater circle, epsilon, eta, beta the lesser, alpha the common center, zeta, iota the path along which the greater circle moves by its own motion, and eta, kappa the path of the smaller circle by its own motion, equal to zeta, lambda. When then I move the smaller circle, I move the same center alpha, and now let the large circle be fixed to it. Whenever therefore alpha beta becomes perpendicular to eta kappa at kappa, alpha gamma at the same time becomes perpendicular to zeta lambda at lambda, so that they will always have traversed an equal distance, eta kappa representing the arc eta beta, and zeta lambda representing the arc zeta gamma. And if one quadrant traces an equal path, it is plain that the whole circle will trace out a path equal to that of the other whole circle, so that whenever the line eta beta comes to kappa, the arc zeta gamma will move along zeta lambda. And the same is the case with the whole circle after one revolution. In like manner, if I roll the large circle, fastening the smaller circle to it about the same center, alpha beta will be perpendicular and vertical at the same time as alpha gamma, the latter to zeta iota at iota, the former to eta theta at theta, so that whenever the one eta beta shall have traversed a distance equal to eta theta, and the other, zeta gamma, a distance equal to zeta iota, and zeta alpha again becomes perpendicular to zeta lambda, and alpha eta to eta kappa, they will be in their original position at the points theta and iota. And since there is no halting of the greater for the lesser, so as to be at rest during an interval at the same point, for in both cases both are moved continuously, nor does the lesser skip any point, it is strange that in one case the greater should traverse a distance equal to that traversed by the lesser, and in the other case the lesser a distance equal to that traversed by the greater. And further, it is wonderful that, though there is always only one movement, the centre that is moved should be rolled forward in one case a great, and in another a less distance. For the same thing moved at the same velocity naturally traverses an equal distance, and to move a thing at the same velocity is to move it an equal distance in both cases. As to the reason, this may be taken as a principle, that the same or an equal force moves one mass more slowly and the other more quickly. Suppose that there is a body which is not naturally in motion of itself. If another body which is naturally in motion move it and itself as well, it will be moved more slowly than if it were being moved by its own motion alone. And if it be naturally in motion, and nothing is moved with it, the same is the case. So it is quite impossible for any body to be moved more than that which moves it, for it is not moved according to any rate of motion of its own, but at the rate of that which moves it. Let there be two circles, a greater alpha and a lesser beta. If the lesser were to push along the greater, when the greater is not rolling along, it is plain that the greater will traverse so much distance as it has been pushed by the lesser, and it has been pushed the same distance as the small circle has moved, so that they have both traversed an equal straight line. Necessarily, therefore, if the lesser be rolling while it pushes the greater, the latter will be rolled, as well as pushed, just so far as the lesser has been rolled, if the greater have no motion of its own. For in the same way, and so far as the moving body moves it, so far must the body which is moved be moved thereby. So indeed the lesser circle has moved the greater so far and in such a way, viz. In a circle, say 1 foot, for let that be the extent of the movement, and consequently the larger circle has moved that distance. So too, if the large circle move the lesser circle will have been moved just as far as the large circle, in whatever way the latter be moved, whether quickly or slowly, by its own motion, and the lesser circle will trace out a line at the same velocity and of the same length as the greater traced out by its natural movement. And this is just what causes the difficulty, that they do not act any longer when they are joined together in the same way as they acted when they were not connected. That is to say, when one is moved by the other not according to its natural motion, nor according to its own motion. For it makes no difference whether one is fixed round the other, or fitted inside it, or placed in contact with it. For in all these cases, when one moves and the other is moved by it, the one will be moved just so far as the other moves it. Now When one moves a circle by means of another circle in contact with it, or suspended from it, one does not revolve it continuously. But if one places them about the same center, the one must be continuously revolved by the other. But nevertheless, the former is not moved in accordance with its own motion, but just as if it had no proper motion; and if it has a proper motion, but does not make use of it, it comes to the same thing. Whenever, therefore, the large circle moves the small circle affixed to it, the small circle moves the same distance as the large, and vice versa. But when they are separate, each has its own motion. If any one raises the difficulty that, when the center is the same and is moving the two circles with equal velocity, they trace out unequal paths, he is reasoning falsely and sophistically. For the center is indeed the same for both, but only accidentally, just as the same thing may chance to be musical and white. For to be the center of each of the circles is not the same for it in the two cases. In conclusion, when it is the smaller circle that moves the greater, the center and source of motion is to be regarded as belonging to the smaller circle; but when the greater circle moves the lesser, it is to be regarded as belonging to the greater circle. Thus the source of motion is not the same absolutely, though it is in a sense the same. Chapter 25. Why do they construct beds so that one dimension is double the other, one side being 6 feet long, or a little more, the other 3 feet? And why do they not stretch bed ropes diagonally? Do they make them of this size so as to fit the body? Thus they have one side twice the length of the other, being 4 cubits long and 2 cubits wide. The ropes are not stretched diagonally, but from side to side, so that the wooden frame may be less likely to break; for wood can be cleft most easily if split thus in the natural way, and when there is a pull upon it, it is subject to a considerable strain. Further, since the ropes have to be able to bear a weight, there will be less of a strain when the weight is put upon them if they are strung crosswise rather than diagonally. Again, less rope is used up by this method. Let alpha, zeta, eta, iota be a bed, and let zeta, eta be divided into 2 equal parts at beta. There is an equal number of holes in zeta beta and zeta alpha, for the sides are equal, each to each, for the whole side zeta eta is double the side zeta alpha. They stretch the rope on the method already mentioned from alpha to beta, then to gamma, delta, theta, and epsilon, and so on until they turn back and reach another angle, for the two ends of the rope come at 2 different angles. Footnote. On this passage, Apelt comments, Figuram in re incerta non adidimus. The above figure is taken from Capelle, who however says that it is impossible to work out the whole process of stringing the bed. The author indicates the general method to be adopted when he says that the rope must be passed from alpha to beta, gamma, delta, theta, and that one rope is to be used, and that its 2 ends come at different corners of the bed. The process can be completed by passing the rope from theta to epsilon, pi, eta, kappa, omicron, pi, rho, sigma, iota, beta, gamma, rho, sigma, nu, lambda, upsilon, mu, delta, theta, upsilon, lambda, omicron, kappa, zeta. End footnote. Now, the parts of the rope which form the bends are equal. Exempli gratia, alpha beta, beta gamma are equal to gamma delta, delta theta. And so with other similar pairs of sides, for the same demonstration holds good in all cases. For alpha beta is equal to epsilon theta. For the opposite sides of the parallelogram, beta, eta, kappa, alpha are equal, and the wholes are an equal distance apart from one another, and beta eta is equal to kappa alpha, for the angle at beta is equal to the angle at eta. For the exterior angle of a parallelogram is equal to the interior opposite angle, and the angle at beta is half a right angle, for zeta beta is equal to zeta alpha, and the angle at zeta is a right angle, and the angle at beta is equal to the angle at eta, for the angle at zeta is a right angle, since the bed is a rectangular figure, one side of which is double the other, and divided into two equal parts, so that beta gamma is equal to epsilon eta, as also is kappa theta, for it is parallel, so that beta gamma is equal to kappa theta, and gamma epsilon to delta theta. In like manner, it can be demonstrated that all the other pairs of sides which form the bends of the rope are equal to one another, so that clearly there are four such lengths of rope as alpha beta in the bed, and there is half the number of holes in the half zeta beta that there is in the whole zeta eta. Footnote. These lines seem more hopelessly corrupt and unintelligible than those preceding them. End footnote. So that in the half of the bed there are lengths of rope, such as alpha beta, and they are of the same number as there are holes in beta eta, or what comes to the same thing, in alpha zeta, zeta beta together. But if the rope be strung diagonally, as in the bed, alpha beta gamma delta, footnote, a figure apparently in which the rope is strung along the diagonals alpha gamma and beta delta, and parallel to them on either side, end footnote, the halves are not of the same length as the sides of both, alpha zeta and zeta eta, but they are of the same number as the holes in zeta beta, zeta alpha. But alpha zeta, zeta beta, being 2, are greater than alpha beta, so that the rope is longer by the amount by which the two sides taken together are greater than the diagonal. Chapter 26. Why is it more difficult to carry a long plank of wood on the shoulder if one holds it at the end than if it is held in the middle, though the weight is the same? Is it because, as the plank vibrates, the end prevents one from carrying it, because it tends to interrupt one's progress by its vibration? No. For if it does not bend at all, and is not very long, it is nevertheless more difficult to carry if it be held at the end. It is easier to carry if one holds it in the middle rather than at the end, for the same reason for which it is easier to lift in that way. The reason is that if one lifts it in the middle, the two ends always lighten one another, and one side lifts the other side up. For the middle, where the lifter or carrier holds it, forms as it were the center, and each of the two ends, inclining downwards, raises up and lightens the other end. Whereas, if it is lifted or carried from one end, this effect is not produced, but all the weight inclines in one direction. Let α be the middle of a plank which is raised or carried, and let β and γ be the extremities. When the plank is lifted or carried at the point α, β inclines downwards and raises γ up, and γ inclines downwards and raises β up. The effect is produced by their being raised up at the same moment. Chapter 27. Why is a very long object more difficult to carry on the shoulder, even if one carries it in the middle, than a shorter object of the same weight? In the last case, we said that the vibration was not the reason. In this case, it is the reason. For the longer an object is, the more its extremities vibrate, and so it would be more difficult for the man to carry it. The reason of the increased vibration is that, though the movement is the same, the extremities change their position more the longer the piece of wood is. Let the shoulder, which is the center, for it is at rest, be at α, and let αβ and αγ be the radii. Then, the longer the radius αβ or αγ is, the greater is the amplitude of movement. This point has already been demonstrated. Chapter 28. Why do they construct swipes by the side of wells by attaching the lead as a weight at the end of the bar, the bucket being itself a weight, whether it is empty or full? Is the reason that the drawing of water being divided into two operations distinct in time, for the bucket has to be dipped and then drawn up, it is an easy task to let it down when it is empty, but difficult to raise it when it is full. It is therefore of advantage to lower it rather more slowly, with a view to lightening the weight considerably when it is drawn up again. This effect is produced by the lead or stone attached to the end of the swipe. In letting it down, there is a heavier weight to lift than if one has merely to lower the empty bucket. But when it is full, the lead, or whatever the weight attached is, helps to draw it up. And so the two operations taken together are easier than on the other method. Chapter 29. Why is it that when two men are carrying an equal weight on a piece of wood or something of the kind, the pressure on them is not equal unless the weight is in the middle, but it presses more on the person carrying it to whom it is nearest? Is it because the wood, when they hold it in this way, becomes a lever, and the load forms the fulcrum, and the carrier nearer to the load becomes the weight which is to be moved, while the other carrier becomes the mover of the weight? The further the latter is from the weight, the more easily he moves it, and the more he presses down the other man, since the load placed on the wood and acting as a fulcrum, as it were, offers resistance. But if the load is placed in the middle, one carrier does not act as a weight on the other any more than the other on him, or exercise any motive force upon him, but each is equally a weight upon the other. Chapter 30. Why is it that when people rise from a sitting position, they always do so by making an acute angle between the thigh and the lower leg, and between the chest and the thigh? Otherwise they cannot rise. Is it because equality is always a cause of rest, and a right angle causes an equality? I.e., when a line is perpendicular, the angles on either side of it are equal, and so causes equilibrium. So, in rising, a man moves towards a position at equal angles to the earth's circumference, for it is not the case that he will actually be at right angles to the ground. Or is it because when a man rises he tends to become upright, and a man who is standing must be perpendicular to the ground? If then he is to be at right angles to the ground, that means that he must have his head in the same line as his feet, and this occurs when he is rising. As long then as he is sitting, he keeps his feet and head parallel to one another, and not in the same straight line. Let alpha be the head, alpha beta the line of the chest, beta gamma the thigh, and gamma delta the lower leg. Then alpha beta, the line of the chest, is at right angles to the thigh, and the thigh at right angles to the lower leg, when a man is seated in this way. In this position, then, a man cannot rise, but to do so he must bend the leg and place the feet at a point under the head. This will be the case if gamma delta be moved to gamma zeta, and the result will be that he can rise immediately, and he will have his head and his feet in the same straight line, and gamma zeta will form an acute angle with beta gamma. Chapter 31. Why is it that a body which is already in motion is easier to move than one which is at rest? For example, a wagon which is in motion can be propelled more quickly than one which has to be started. Is it because, in the first place, it is very difficult to move in one direction a weight which is already moving in the opposite direction? For, though the motive force may be much quicker, yet some of it is lost, for the propulsion exerted by that which is being pushed in the opposite direction must necessarily become slower. And so, secondly, the propulsion must be slower if the body is at rest, for even that which is at rest offers resistance. When a body is moving in the same direction as that which pushes it, the effect is just as if one increased the force and speed of the motive power, for by moving forward it produces of itself exactly the effect which that power would have upon it. Chapter 32. Why is it that an object which is thrown eventually comes to a standstill? Does it stop when the force which started it fails, or because the object is drawn in a contrary direction? Or is it due to its downward tendency, which is stronger than the force which threw it? Or is it absurd to discuss such questions while the principle escapes us? Chapter 33. How is it that a body is carried along by a motion not its own, if that which started it does not keep following and pushing it along? Is it not clear that in the beginning the impelling force so acted as to push one thing along, and this in its turn pushes along something else? The moving body comes to a standstill when the force which pushes it along can no longer so act as to push it, and when the weight of the moving object has a stronger inclination downwards than the forward force of that which pushes it. Chapter 34. Why is it that neither small nor large bodies travel far when thrown, but they must have due relation to the person who throws them? Is it because that which is thrown or pushed must offer resistance to that from which it is pushed, and whatever does not yield owing to its mass, or does not resist owing to its weakness, does not admit of being thrown or pushed? A body, then, which is far beyond the force which tries to push it, does not yield at all, while that which is far weaker offers no resistance. Or is it because that which travels along does so only as far as it moves the air to its depths, and that which is not moved cannot itself move anything either? Both these things are the case here. That which is very large and that which is very small must be looked upon as not moving at all, for the latter does not move anything, while the former is not itself at all moved. Chapter 35. Why is it that an object which is carried round in whirling water is always eventually carried into the middle? Is it because the object has magnitude, so that it has position in two circles, one of its extremities revolving in a greater and the other in a lesser circle? The greater circle, then, on account of its greater velocity, draws it round and thrusts it sideways into the lesser circle. But since the object has breadth, the lesser circle in its turn does the same thing and thrusts it into the next interior circle until it reaches the center. Here the object remains because it stands in the same relation to all the circles, being in the middle, for the middle is equidistant from the circumference in the case of each of the circles. Or is it because an object which, owing to its magnitude, the motion of the whirling water cannot overcome, but which by its weight prevails over the velocity of the revolving circle, must necessarily be left behind and travel along more slowly? Now the lesser circle travels more slowly, for the greater and the lesser circle do not revolve over the same space in an equal time when they move round the same center, and so the object must be left revolving in a lesser and lesser circle until it reaches the middle. If the force of the whirling water prevails at first, it will go on doing so to the end, for one circle must prevail, and then the next over the weight of the object owing to their velocity, so that the whole object is continually being left behind in the next circle towards the center. For an object over which the water does not prevail must be carried either inwards or outwards. Such an object cannot then be carried along in its original position. Still less can it be carried along in the outer circle, for the velocity of the outer circle is greater. The only alternative is that the object over which the water does not prevail is transferred to the inner circle. Now every object has a tendency to resist force, but since the arrival at the middle puts an end to motion, and the center alone is at rest, all objects must necessarily collect there. End of chapter 35 and end of Mechanica by Aristotle. Concerning Indivisible Lines by Aristotle, translated by Harold H. Joachim. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Geoffrey Edwards. De Lines Insecabilibus. Introductory note. The treatise Peri Atomon Grammon, as it is printed in Becker's text of Aristotle, is to a large extent unintelligible. But M. Hayduck, in the valuable paper which he contributed to the Neujahrbucher für Philologie und Pädagogik, Volume 109, Part 1, Teubner, 1874, prepared the way, and Otto Appelt, profiting by Hayduck's labors and by a fresh collation of the manuscripts, published a more satisfactory text in his volume Aristotelis quae feruntur de plantis, etc. Teubner, 1888. Many of the most difficult passages are discussed and elucidated in the prolegomena to this volume. Finally, Appelt included a German translation of the treatise in his Beiträge zur Geschichte der griechischen Philosophie, Teubner, 1891. In the following paraphrase, I have endeavored to make a full use of the work of Hayduck and Appelt, with a view to reproducing the subtle and somewhat intricate thought of the author, whoever he may have been. Though the treatise is published amongst the works of Aristotle, there are grounds for ascribing it to Theophrastus, whilst, for all we can tell, it may have been written neither by Aristotle nor by Theophrastus, but by Strato, or possibly by someone otherwise unknown. But the work, no matter who wrote it, is interesting for the close texture of its reasoning, and for the light which it throws on certain obscure places in Plato and Aristotle. Its value for the student of the history of mathematics is no doubt considerable, but my own ignorance of this subject makes me hesitate to express an opinion. I take this opportunity of thanking three of my friends, E. I. Carlyle, Fellow of Lincoln College, and A. L. Dixon, Fellow of Merton College, for their help in several of the mathematical passages, and W. D. Ross, Fellow of Oriel College, for his valuable suggestions, most of which I have adopted. H. J. January 1908. Concerning indivisible lines. Are there indivisible lines? And generally, is there a simple unit in every class of quanta? Section 1. Some people maintain this thesis on the following grounds. 1. If we recognize the validity of the predicates big and great, we must equally recognize the validity of their opposites, little and small. Now, that which admits practically an infinite number of divisions is big, not little, or great, not small. Hence the little quantum and the small quantum will clearly admit only a finite number of divisions. But if the divisions are finite in number, there must be a simple magnitude. Hence, in all classes of quanta, there will be found a simple unit, since in all of them the predicates little and small apply. 2. Again, if there is an idea of line, and if the idea is first of the things called by its name, then, since the parts are by nature prior to their whole, the ideal line must be indivisible. And on the same principle, the ideal square, the ideal triangle, and all the other ideal figures, and generalizing, the ideal plane, and the ideal solid must be without parts, for otherwise it will result that there are elements prior to each of them. 3. Again, if body consists of elements, and if there is nothing prior to the elements, fire, and generally each of the elements which are the constituents of body, must be indivisible, for the parts are prior to their whole. Hence there must be a simple unit in the objects of sense as well as in the objects of thought. 4. Again, Zeno's argument proves that there must be simple magnitudes. For the body, which is moving along a line, must reach the halfway point before it reaches the end. And since there always is a halfway point in any stretch which is not simple, motion, unless there be simple magnitudes, involves that the moving body touches successively, one by one, an infinite number of points in a finite time, which is impossible. But even if the body which is moving along the line does touch the infinity of points in a finite time, an absurdity results. For since the quicker the movement of the moving body, the greater the stretch which it traverses in an equal time, and since the movement of thought is quickest of all movements, it follows that thought too will come successively into contact with an infinity of objects in a finite time. And since thoughts coming into contact with objects one by one is counting, we must admit that it is possible to count the units of an infinite sum in a finite time. But since this is impossible, there must be such a thing as an indivisible line. 5. Again, the being of indivisible lines, it is maintained, follows from the mathematicians' own statements. For if we accept their definition of commensurate lines as those which are measured by the same unit of measurement, and if we suppose that all commensurate lines actually are being measured, there will be some actual length by which all of them will be measured, and this length must be indivisible. For if it is divisible, its parts, since they are commensurate with the whole, will involve some unit of measurement measuring both them and their whole. And thus the original unit of measurement would turn out to be twice one of its parts, viz. Twice its half. But since this is impossible, there must be an indivisible unit of measurement. And just as all the lines which are compounded of the unit are composed of simples, so also the lines which the unit measures once consist of simples. And the same can be shown to follow in the plane figures too. For all the squares which are drawn on the rational lines are commensurate with one another, and therefore by the preceding argument their unit of measurement will be simple. But if, per impossibile, any such unit square be cut along any prescribed and determinate line, that line will be neither rational nor irrational, nor any of the recognized kinds of irrational lines which produce rational squares, such as the apotome or the line ex duobus nominibus. Such lines, at which the unit square might be divided, will have no nature of their own at all, though relatively to one another they will be rational or irrational. Section 2. To these arguments we must make the following answers. 1a. In the first place, it does not follow that the quantum, which admits an infinite number of divisions, is not small or little. For we apply the predicate small to place and magnitude, and generally to the continuous, and in some quanta the predicate little is suitably applied. And nevertheless we affirm that these quanta admit an infinite number of divisions. 1b. Moreover, if in the composite magnitude there are contained indivisible lines, the predicate small is applied to these indivisible lines, and each of them contains an infinite number of points. But each of them, qua line, admits of division at a point, and equally at any and every point. Hence each of these indivisible lines would admit an infinite number of divisions, just like the non-indivisible lines. Moreover, some amongst the non-indivisible lines are small. But every non-indivisible line admits of division in accordance with any prescribed ratio, and the ratios, in accordance with which any such line may be divided, are infinite in number. 1c. Again, since the great is compounded of certain smalls, the great will either be nothing, or it will be identical with that which admits a finite number of divisions. For the whole admits the divisions admitted by its parts, i.e., its divisions are finite or infinite, according as their divisions are finite or infinite. It is unreasonable that, whilst the small admits a finite number of divisions only, the great should admit an infinite number, and yet this is what the advocates of the theory postulate. It is clear, therefore, that it is not qua admitting a finite and an infinite number of divisions that quanta are called small and great respectively, and to argue that because in numbers the little number admits a finite number of divisions, therefore in lines the small line must admit only a finite number of divisions, is childish. For in numbers the more complex are developed out of simples, and there is a determinate something from which the whole series of the numbers starts, and every number which is not infinite admits a finite number of divisions, but in magnitudes the case is not parallel. 2. As to those who try to establish the being of the indivisible lines by arguments drawn from the ideal lines, we may perhaps say that in positing ideas of these quanta, they are assuming a premise too narrow to carry their conclusion, and by arguing thus, they in a sense destroy the premises which they use to prove their conclusion, for their arguments destroy the ideas. 3. Again, as to the corporeal elements, it is childish to postulate them as simple. For even though some physicists do as a matter of fact make this statement about them, yet to assume this for the present inquiry is a petitio principii, or rather, the more obviously the argument would appear to involve a petitio principii, the more the opinion is confirmed that solids and lengths are divisible in bulk and distance. 4. The argument of Zeno does not establish that the moving body comes into contact with the infinite number of points in a finite time, if the period and the path of the motion are considered on the same principle. For the time and the length are called both infinite and finite from different points of view, and admit of the same divisions if considered both on the same principle. Nor is thoughts coming into contact with the members of an infinite series one by one counting, even if it were supposed that thought does come into contact in this way with the members of an infinite series. Such a supposition perhaps assumes what is impossible, for the movement of thought does not, like the movement of moving bodies, essentially involve continua and substrata. If, however, the possibility of thought moving in this fashion be admitted, still this moving is not counting, for counting is movement combined with pausing. It is absurd, we may perhaps suggest to our opponents, that because you are unable to solve Zeno's argument, you should make yourselves slaves of your inability, and should commit yourselves to still greater errors in the endeavor to support your incompetence. 5. As to what they say about commensurate lines, that all lines, because commensurate, are measured by one and the same actual unit of measurement, this is sheer sophistry, nor is it in the least in accordance with the mathematical assumption as to commensurability. For the mathematicians do not make the assumption in this form, nor is it of any use to them. Moreover, it is actually inconsistent to postulate both that every line becomes commensurate, and that there is a common measure of all commensurate lines. Hence their procedure is ridiculous, since, whilst professing that they are going to demonstrate their thesis in accordance with the opinions of the mathematicians, and by premises drawn from the mathematicians' own statements, they lapse into an argument which is a mere piece of contentious and sophistical dialectic, and such a feeble piece of sophistry too. For it is feeble in many respects, and totally unable to escape paradox on the one side, and destructive scientific criticism on the other. Moreover, it would be absurd for people to be led astray by Zeno's argument, and to be persuaded, because they cannot refute it, to invent indivisible lines, and yet to pay no attention to all those theorems concerning lines, in which it is proved that it is impossible for a movement to be generated such that in it the moving thing does not fall successively on each of the intervening points before reaching the end point. For the theorems in question are far better established and more generally admitted than the arguments of Zeno. Section 3. It is clear, then, that the being of indivisible lines is neither demonstrated nor rendered plausible, at any rate by the arguments which we have quoted. And this conclusion will grow clearer in the light of the following considerations. A. In the first place, our result will be confirmed by reflection on the conclusions proved in mathematics, and on the assumptions there laid down. Conclusions and assumptions which we have no right to reject except on more convincing arguments than those adduced by the advocates of indivisible lines. For 1. Neither the definition of line nor that of straight line will apply to the indivisible line, since the latter is not between any terminal points and does not possess a middle. 2. Secondly, all lines will be commensurate, for all lines, both those which are commensurate in length and those which produce commensurate squares, will be measured by the indivisible lines, and the indivisible lines are all of them commensurate in length, for they are all equal to one another, and therefore also they all produce commensurate squares. But if so, then the square on any line will always be rational. 3. Again, since in a rectangle the line applied at right angles to the longer side determines the breadth of the figure, the rectangle which is equal in area to the square on the indivisible line, verbi gratia, on the line 1 foot long, will, if applied to a line double the indivisible line, verbi gratia, to a line 2 feet long, have a breadth determined by a line shorter than the indivisible line, for its breadth will be less than the breadth of the square on the indivisible line. 4. Again, since any three given straight lines can be combined to form a triangle can also be formed by combining three given indivisible lines. Such a triangle will be equilateral, but in every equilateral triangle, the perpendicular dropped from the apex bisects the base. Hence, in the equilateral triangle, whose sides are the indivisible lines, the indivisible base will be bisected by the perpendicular dropped from its apex. 5. Again, if the square can be constructed of simples, i.e., with indivisible lines as its sides, then let its diagonal be drawn and a perpendicular dropped from one angle onto the diagonal. the square on the side, i.e., the original square constructed with simples as its sides, will be equal to the square on the perpendicular, together with the square on half the diagonal. Hence the side of the square, i.e., the indivisible line, will not be the smallest line. Nor will the area which is the square on the diagonal be double the square on the indivisible line. For suppose it to be so, then if from the diagonal a length equal to the side of the original square be subtracted, the remaining portion of the diagonal will be less than the simple line. For if the remaining portion of the diagonal were not less than but equal to the simple line, the square on the diagonal would have been 4 times the original square. And one might collect other similar absurdities to which the doctrine leads, for indeed it conflicts with practically everything in mathematics. B. Then again, the following arguments support our criticism of the doctrine. 1. The simple admits of only one mode of conjunction, but a line admits of 2. For one line may be conjoined to another either by contact along the whole length of both lines, or by contact at either of its opposite terminal points. 2. Further, the addition of a line will not, on the theory, make the whole line any longer than the original line to which the addition was made, for simples will not, by being added together, produce an increased total magnitude. 3. Further, every continuous quantum admits more divisions than one, and therefore no continuous quantum can be formed out of 2 simples. And since every line other than the indivisible line is admittedly continuous, there can be no indivisible line. For if there were a continuous quantum, viz., the line formed by the conjunction of 2 indivisible lines would be formed out of 2 simples. 4. Further, if every line other than the indivisible line can be divided both into equal and into unequal parts, every line, even if it consist of 3 or any odd number of indivisible lines, it will follow that the indivisible line is divisible. And the same will result if every line admits of bisection, for then every line consisting of an odd number of indivisible lines will admit of bisection, and this will involve the division of the indivisible line. And if not every line, but only lines consisting of an even number of units admit of bisection, still even so, the indivisible line will be divided, when the line consisting of an even number of units is divided into unequal parts by progressive bisection. C. Again, the following arguments must be considered against the doctrine. 1. If a body has been set in motion and takes a certain time to traverse a certain stretch, and half that time to traverse half that stretch, it will traverse less than half the stretch in less than half the time. Hence, if the stretch be a length consisting of an odd number of indivisible unit lines, we shall here again find the bisection of the indivisible lines, since the body will traverse half the stretch in the half time, for the time and the line will be correspondingly divided. So that none of the composite lines will admit of division both into equal and into unequal parts, nor will they admit of division corresponding to the division of the times if there are to be indivisible lines. And yet, as we said, the truth is that the same argument which leads to the view that lines consist of simples, leads by logical necessity to the view that all these things, composite times, exempli gratia, as well as composite lines, consist of simples. 2. Further, every line which is not infinite has 2 terminal points, for line is defined by these. Now the indivisible line is not infinite, and will therefore have a terminal point. Hence it is divisible, for the terminal point and that which it terminates are different from one another. Otherwise there will be a third kind of line, which is neither finite nor infinite. 3. Further, there will not be a point contained in every line. For there will be no point contained in the indivisible line, since if it contains one point only, a line will be a point, whilst if it contains more than one point, it will be divisible. And if there is no point in the indivisible line, neither will there be a point in any line at all. For all the other lines are made up out of the indivisible lines. Moreover, if there are points in the indivisible line, there will either be nothing between the points or a line. But if there is a line between them, and if all lines contain more points than one, the unit line will not be indivisible. 4. Again, it will not be possible to construct a square on every line, for a square will always possess length and breadth, and will therefore be divisible, since each of its dimensions, its length and its breadth, is a determinate something. But if the square is divisible, then so will be the line on which it is constructed. 5. Again, the limit of the line will be a line and not a point. For it is the ultimate thing which is a limit, and it is the indivisible line which is ultimate. For if the ultimate thing be point, then the limit to the indivisible line will be a point, and one line will be longer than another by a point. But if it be urged that the limiting point is contained within the indivisible line, on the ground that two lines united so as to form a continuous line have one and the same limit at their juncture, then the simple line, i.e. the line without parts, will after all have a limit belonging to it. And indeed, how will a point differ at all from a line on their theory? For the indivisible line will possess nothing characteristic to distinguish it from the point, except the name. 6. Again, if there be indivisible lines, there must, by parity of reasoning, be indivisible planes and solids too. For the being of an indivisible unit in one dimension will carry with it the being of indivisibles in the remaining dimensions too, since it is at a plane that a solid is divided, and at a line that a plane is divided. But there is no indivisible solid, for a solid contains depth and breadth. Hence neither can there be an indivisible line, for a solid is divisible at a plane, and a plane is divisible at a line. But since the arguments by which they endeavour to convince us are weak and false, and since the opinions which they are trying to establish conflict with all the most convincing arguments, it is clear that there can be no indivisible line. Section 4. And it is further clear from the above considerations that a line can no more be composed of points than of indivisible lines. For the same arguments, or most of them, will apply equally against both views. For 1. It will necessarily follow that the point is divided, when the line composed of an odd number of points is divided into equal parts, or when the line composed of an even number of points is divided into unequal parts. And 2. It will follow that the part of a line is not a line, nor the part of a plane a plane. Further, 3. It will follow that one line is longer than another by a point. For it is by its constituent elements that one line will exceed another. But that it is impossible for one line to be longer than another by a point is clear both from what is proved in mathematics and from the following argument. For if it were possible, the absurd consequence would result that the moving body would take a time to traverse the point. For as it traverses the equal line in an equal time, it will traverse the longer line in a greater time, and that by which the greater time exceeds the equal time is itself a time. Perhaps, however, we are to suppose that just as a line consists of points, so also time consists of nows, and both theses belong to the same way of thinking. Let us then examine the doctrine that a line, or generally continua, like times and lengths, consist of discrete elements. A. Since then the now is a beginning and end of a time, and the point a beginning and end of a line, and since the beginning of anything is not continuous with its end, but they have an interval between them, it follows that neither nows nor points can be continuous with one another. B. Again, a line is a magnitude, but the composition of points constitutes no magnitude, because several points put together occupy no more space than one. For when one line is superimposed on another and coincides with it, the breadth is in no wise increased. And since points too are contained in the line thus superimposed, it follows that neither would points, by being superimposed on points, occupy more space. Hence, points would not constitute a magnitude by composition. C. Again, whenever one thing is contiguous with another, the contact is either whole with whole, or part with part, or whole with part. But the point is without parts. Hence the contact of point with point must be a contact whole with whole. But if one thing is in contact with another whole with whole, the two things must be one. For if either of them is anything in any respect in which the other is not, they would not be in contact whole with whole. But if the simples, when in contact, are not one but coincident, then a plurality occupies the same place which was formerly occupied by one. For if two things are coincident, and neither admits of being extended beyond the coincidence, just so far the place occupied by both is the same. And since the simple has no dimension, it follows that a continuous magnitude cannot be composed of simples. Hence, neither can a line consist of points, nor a time of nows. D. Further, if the line consists of points, point will be in contact with point. If then from K there be drawn the lines AB and CD, the point B in the line ABK, and the point C in the line KCD, will both be in contact with K, so that the points B and C will also be in contact with one another. For the simple, when in contact with the simple, is in contact whole with whole, so that the points will occupy the same place as K, and Q in contact with K will be in the same place with one another. But if they are in the same place with one another, they must also be in contact with one another. For things which are in the same continent place must be in contact. But if this is so, one straight line will touch another straight line in 2 points. For the point B in the line AK touches both the point KC and another, viz. The point contiguous to C in the line KCD. Hence the line AK touches the line CD in more points than one. And the same argument would apply not only in the case supposed where 2 lines were in contact with one another at the point K, but also if there had been any number of lines touching one another at K. E. Further, if a line consists of points in contact with one another, the circumference of a circle will touch the tangent at more points than one. For both the point on the circumference and the point in the tangent touch the point of junction and also touch one another. But since this is not possible, neither is it possible for point to touch point. And if point cannot touch point, neither can the line consist of points, for if it did, they would necessarily be in contact. F. Moreover, how, on the supposition that the line consists of points, will there any longer be straight and curved lines? For the conjunction of the points in the straight line will not differ in any way from their conjunction in the curved line. For the contact of simple with simple is contact whole with whole, and simples admit no other mode of contact. Since then the straight and curved lines are different, but the conjunction of points is invariably the same, clearly a line will not be curved or straight because of the conjunction. Hence neither will a line consist of points. G. Further, the points of which the line consists must either touch or not touch one another. Now if the next in a series must touch the preceding term, the same arguments which were advanced above will apply. But if there can be a next without its being in contact with its predecessor or successor, yet by the continuous we mean nothing but a composite whose constituents are in contact, so that the points forming the line must be in contact in so far as the line must be continuous, even though we suppose the points to be a series. H. Etie atopon stigme epistigmes episteme z, hin e pz, grame kai epistigme, grame kai epistemes and w, episteme kai grame z, epe he grame epipedon adenaton ta erimena enai. 4. If the points form a series without contact, the line will be divided not at either of the points, but between them, whilst if they are in contact, a line will be the place of the single point, and this is impossible. J. Further, all things would be divided, i.e., be dissolved into points, and the point would be a part of a solid, since the solid, on the theory, consists of planes, the plane of lines, and the lines of points. And since those constituents of which, as their primary immanent factors, the various groups of things are composed, are elements, points would be elements of bodies. Hence elements would be identical in nature as well as in name, and not even specifically different. Section 5. It is clear then from the above arguments that a line does not consist of points. A. But neither is it possible to subtract a point from a line. For if a point can be subtracted, it can also be added. But if anything is added, that to which it was added will be bigger than it was at first, if that which is added be such as to coalesce and form one whole with it. Hence a line will be bigger than another line by a point, and this is impossible. But though it is not possible to subtract a point as such from a line, one may subtract it incidentally, viz. In so far as a point is contained in the line, which one is subtracting from another line. For since, if the whole be subtracted, its beginning and its end are subtracted too, and since the beginning and the end of a line are points, then if it be possible to subtract a line from a line, it will be possible also thereby to subtract a point. But such a subtraction of a point is incidental or per accidens. B. But if the limit touches that of which it is the limit, touches either it or some one of its parts, and if the point qua limit of the line touches the line, then the line will be greater than another line by a point, and the point will consist of points, for there is nothing between two things in contact. The same argument applies in the case of division, since the division is a point, and qua dividing point is in contact with something. It applies also in the case of a solid and a plane, and the solid must consist of planes, the plane of lines, just as, on the theory, the line consists of points. C. Neither is it true to say of a point that it is the smallest constituent of a line. 1. For if it be called the smallest of the things contained in the line, what is smallest is also smaller than those things of which it is the smallest. But in the line there is contained nothing but points and lines, and the line is not bigger than the point, for neither is the plane bigger than the line. Hence the point will not be the smallest of the constituents in the line. 2. And if the point is comparable in magnitude with the line, yet, since the smallest involves 3 degrees of comparison, the point will not be the smallest of the constituents of the line, or there will be other things in the length besides the points and lines, so that it will not consist of points. But since that which is in place is either a point or a length, or a plane or a solid, or some compound of these, and since the constituents of a line are in place, for the line is in place, and since neither a solid nor a plane, nor anything compounded of these is contained in the line, there can be absolutely nothing in the length except points and lines. 3. Further, since that which is called greater than that which is in place is a length, or a surface, or a solid, then, since the point is in place, and since that which is contained in the length, besides points and lines, is none of the aforementioned, the point cannot be the smallest of the constituents of a length. 4. Further, since the smallest of the things contained in a house is so called, without in the least comparing the house with it, and so in all other cases, neither will the smallest of the constituents in the line be determined by comparison with the line. Hence the term smallest applied to the point will not be suitable. 5. Further, that which is not in the house is not the smallest of the constituents of the house, and so in all other cases. Hence, since the point can exist per se, it will not be true to say of it that it is the smallest thing in the line. D. Lastly, the point is not an indivisible joint. For 1. The joint is always a limit of 2 things, but the point is a limit of 1 line as well as of 2. Moreover, 2. The point is an end, but the joint is more of the nature of a division. Again, 3. The line and the plane will be joints too, for they are analogous to the point. Again, 4. The joint is, in a sense, on account of movement, which explains the verse of Empedocles, but the point is found also in the immovable things. 5. Again, nobody has an infinity of joints in his body or his hand, but he has an infinity of points. 6. Moreover, there is no joint of a stone, nor has it any, but it has points. End of Concerning Indivisible Lines. The Situations and Names of Winds by Aristotle. Translated by Edward Forster. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Geoffrey Edwards. Note: gaps in this recording indicate portions of the text which have been lost. Ventorum situs et cognomina. Preface. This short extract from the peripatetic treatise De Signis, usually attributed to Theophrastus, is chiefly interesting for comparison with the charts of the winds given in the Meteorologica and De Mundo. The text used for this translation is that of O. Appelt, who has in the main followed V. Rose's edition. The latter is a great improvement on Becker's text. I have to thank Mr. W. D. Ross and my colleague, Professor W. C. Summers, for several suggestions. Ventorum situs et appellationes ex Aristotelis, Libro de Signis. Boreas, the north wind. At Malus, this wind is called Pagreus, for it blows from the high cliffs and two parallel ranges known as the Pagrean Mountains. At Caunus, it is called Melissus, the northeast wind. In Rhodes, it is known as Caunius, for it blows from Caunus, causing storms in the harbor of that place. At Olbia, near Magudum in Pamphylia, it is called Idureus, for it blows from an island called Idris. Some people identify Boreas and Melissus, amongst them the Lernacians near Phasaelis. Caecias, the northeast wind. In Lesbos, this wind is called Thebanus, for it blows from the plain of Thebe, north of the Elytic Gulf in Mysia. It causes storms in the harbor of Mytilene and very violent storms in the harbor of Malis. In some places it is called Caunius, which others identify with Boreas. Apeliotes, the east wind. This wind is called Ptolemeus at Tripolis in Phoenicia. It blows from a plain resembling a great threshing floor, which lies between the mountains of Libanus and Papyrus. Hence it is called Ptolemeus. It causes storms at Poseidonium. In the Gulf of Issus and the neighborhood of Rossus, it is known as Syriandus. It blows from the Syrian gates, the pass between the Taurus and the Rossian mountains. In the Gulf of Tripolis, it is called Marseus, from the village of Marsus. In Proconnesus, Teos, Crete, Euboea, and Cyrene, it is known as Hellespontius. It causes storms in particular at Caphareus in Euboea, and in the harbor of Cyrene, which is called Apollonia. It blows from the Hellespont. At Sinope it is called Bericuntius, because it blows from the direction of Phrygia. In Sicily it is known as Cataporthmius, because it blows from the straits. Some people identify it with Caecias, and also call it Thebanus. Eurus, the southeast wind. This wind is called Scopelius at Aigai, on the borders of Syria, after the cliff at Rossus. In Cyrene, it is known as Carbus, after the Carbanians in Phoenicia. Wherefore, some people call this same wind Phoenicius. Some people identify it with Apeliotes. Euronotus, the south-southeast wind. Some call this wind Eurus, others Amneus. Notice, the south wind bears the same name everywhere. It is derived from the fact that this wind is unwholesome, while out of doors it brings showers. Thus there are two reasons for its name. Leuconitus, the white or clearing south wind, likewise derives its name from its effect, for it clears the sky. Lips, the southwest wind. This wind gets its name from Libya, whence it blows. Zephyrus, the west wind. This wind is so named because it blows from the west, and the west. Eopux, the northwest wind. At Tarentum it is called Sculatinus, from the place Sculatium. At Dorlium in Phrygia it is called. Some people call it Pharanghites because it blows from a certain ravine in Mount Pangaeus. Many call it Argestes. Thrascius, the north-northwest wind, is called Strumonius in Thrace, for it blows from the river Strumon. In the Megarid it is known as Sciron, after the Scironian cliffs. In Italy and Sicily it is called Circius, because it blows from Circaeum. In Euboea and Lesbos it goes by the name of Olympias, which is derived from Pierian Olympus. It causes storms at Pyrrha. I have drawn the circle of the earth, and indicated the positions of the winds, and the directions in which they blow, so that they may be presented to your vision. End of The Situations and Names of Winds. On Melissus, Xenophanes, and Gorgias. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Geoffrey Edwards. On Melissus, Xenophanes, and Gorgias by Aristotle. Translated by Edward Forster and T. Loveday. De Melissus. Chapter 1. Melissus says that if anything is, it is eternal, since it is impossible that anything can come into being from nothing. For suppose that either all things or some things have come into being, in either case they must be eternal, for otherwise, in coming into being, they would do so out of nothing. For if all things come into being, then nothing can pre-exist, whilst if some things were ever and others are added, that which is must have become more and greater, and that by which it is more and greater must have arisen out of nothing, for the more is not originally existent in the less, nor the greater in the smaller. Being, since it is eternal, is unlimited, for it has no beginning from which it has come into being, and no end in which, when it comes into being, it can ever terminate. Being all and unlimited, it is one, for if it were two or more, these would be reciprocal limits. Being one, it must be similar throughout, for if it were dissimilar, it would be several, and therefore no longer one, but many. Being eternal and unlimited and alike throughout, the one is without motion, for it could not move without passing somewhere else, and it can only pass either into that which is full or into that which is empty, but of these the former could not admit it, while the latter is nothing at all. Such being the nature of the one, it is unaffected by grief and pain, and is healthy and free from disease, and cannot change either by transposition or by change of form, or by mixture with anything else; for under all these circumstances the one becomes many, and not being is necessarily generated and being destroyed. But these are impossibilities. For indeed, if it were maintained that any one is the result of a mixture of several constituents, suppose, that is, that things were many, and moved into one another, and that their mixture were either by way of the composition of the many in one, or, being due to the constituents fitting in with one another, resulted in their covering one another from view; then, in the former case, the constituents mixed would be easily discernible, being distinct; whilst, if they covered one another, rubbing would reveal each constituent, the successive layers being uncovered as the upper layers were removed. Now, neither of these things happens; but, according to Melissus, it is only in these ways that a many could both be and also appear to us; and, since these ways are impossible, that which is cannot be manifold, and the belief that it is manifold is erroneous, like many other fancies which are due to the senses. But argument does not prove either that things come into being, or that what is many, but that it is one and eternal and unlimited and similar throughout. Now, surely, one ought firstly to begin by taking not any and every opinion, but those which are most indisputable. If, then, all our opinions are incorrectly conceived, it is perhaps quite wrong to adopt this doctrine too, that nothing can ever come into being out of nothing; for this is but a single opinion, and an incorrect one too, which we somehow all of us have often been led to conceive from our sense perceptions. But if not all that appears to us is false, and some conceptions even of objects of sense are correct, either one ought to demonstrate the nature of such a correct conception, and then adopt it, or else demonstrate and adopt those which appear most likely to be correct; and these must always be more indisputable than the conclusions, which are apt to follow from the arguments of Melissus. For supposing that we really had to do with two contrary opinions, as Melissus thinks, his arguments show that he thinks so, videlicet, if there is a many, it must needs arise from what is not; and if the consequent is impossible, what is not many; for, being ungenerated, anything which is unlimited, and therefore one. Supposing this so, still, if we admit both propositions equally, unity is no more proved than multiplicity; and it is only if one proposition is more indisputable than the other that the conclusions following from it are better proved. Now, as a matter of fact, we do entertain both these conceptions, namely, that nothing can come to be out of nothing, and also that existents are many and are in motion; and of the two the latter is more generally credited, and every one would more readily give up the former opinion than this. Now, if it were the case that the two propositions are contrary to one another, and it were impossible that at the same time nothing should come to be out of not being, and there should be a multiplicity of things, each of these views would refute the other. But why should his premises be correct? Some one else might assert the exact opposite; for he has not argued his case either by showing that it is a correct opinion from which he starts, or by taking a more certain opinion than that with which his proof is concerned; for it is usually considered more likely that being arises out of not being, than that there is not a multiplicity of things. It is confidently asserted about existence, that things which do not exist come into being, nay, often have come into being out of non-existence; and those who have asserted this are no ordinary men, but some of those who are looked upon as sages. To begin with, Hesiod says, "First of all in the world was chaos born, and thereafter broad-bosomed earth arose, firm seat of all things forever, and love that shineth bright amid the host of immortals." All the other things, he says, came into being from these, but these came into being out of nothing. Secondly, there are many who say that nothing is, but all things become, declaring that whatever becomes does not arise from existence; For if what becomes arose from existence, then their statement that all things become would be false. So much therefore is clear, that there are some people of the opinion that becoming even out of non-existence is possible. Chapter 2. But had we not better leave aside the possibility or impossibility of his conclusions, and confine ourselves to what may very well be a distinct problem, namely, whether these conclusions follow from the premises which he takes, or other conclusions might logically be derived from these premises? And first of all, granted his first assumption, that nothing can come to be from not being, does it necessarily follow that all things are ungenerated? Or is there no reason why one thing should not have come to be out of another, and so on in an endless series? Or may it not go on in a circular process in such a way that one thing has come to be out of another, there thus being always something in existence, and all things having come to be out of one another an endless number of times? In that case, although it be agreed that nothing can come to be out of not being, everything may very well have come to be, and none of the attributes which are attached to the one prevents our calling existence unlimited in Melissus's sense of the word, for he himself attributes to the unlimited that it actually is, and is synonymous with all. And even if existents are not unlimited, there is no reason why they should not come to be by the circular process. Further, if all things come to be, and nothing is, as some declare, how can they be eternal? Yet he certainly argues as though the existence of something were real and agreed. For he says, if a thing has not come to be, but is, it must be eternal, as though being were necessarily inherent in things. Moreover, however impossible it may be for not being to come to be, or for being to be destroyed, yet what prevents some existing things from having come to be, and others from being eternal, as Empedocles also affirms? For after admitting all this, namely, that out of that which is not can nothing come into being, and whatsoever exists, no art nor device can destroy it, for it will always abide, where'er 'tis implanted, forever. He yet declares that of existence some are eternal, namely fire, water, earth, and air, but that the rest of things come to be, and have come to be, out of these. For in his opinion there is no other process whereby existence can come to be. Save the mingling of things and exchanging of things that are mingled, this, in the speech of men, is called the work of begetting. But he denies that the being of the eternal things, and of what really is the result of a process of coming to be. For this he considers impossible, for he says, how could aught bring increase to the all, and whence have arisen? But the many come to be by the mixture and composition of fire and the other elements, and perish again when those elements are exchanged and separated. That is, by mixture and separation many things are at any time, but by nature there are only four, apart from the causes, or else only one. Or again, if these elements, out of the composition of which things come to be, and by the dissolution of which they are destroyed, were from the first unlimited, which is what some affirm that Anaxagoras means when he says that things which come to be do so out of things that are ever existent and unlimited, even so not all things would be eternal, but there would be some things coming to be, and having come to be from things that are, and passing by destruction into other modes of being. Furthermore, there is no reason why one form should not constitute the all, as Anaximander and Anaximenes say, the former declaring that the all is water, while Anaximenes says that it is air, and as others say who have contended along these lines, that the all is one. And why this, by assuming various shapes, and greater or less bulk, that is, by coming to be in a rare or dense state, should not make up the many unlimited objects which exist, and come to be, and compose the whole. Again, Democritus declares that water and air, and each of the many things that exist, are essentially the same, but differ in their rhythm. Why should not the many come to be, and be destroyed even in this way, the one changing continually from being to being by the above-mentioned differences, and the whole becoming not a whit either greater or less? Furthermore, why should not bodies from time to time come to be from other bodies, and be dispersed into bodies, and thus by dissolution, the process of generation and decay, always balance one another? But if one were to make these concessions, and allow that being both exists and is ungenerated, how is its unlimitedness thereby more clearly demonstrated? For Melissus declares it to be unlimited if it exists, but has not come to be. For the beginning and end of the process of coming to be are, he says, limits. Yet what in his argument prevents a thing which is ungenerated from having a limit? For if a thing has come to be, he contends that it has as a beginning that from which it began coming to be. Now, why should it not have a beginning, even if it has not come to be? Not, however, one from which it has come to be, but some other. And why should not existence, though eternal, be limited in relation to one another? Again, why should not the whole, being ungenerated, be unlimited, but the things which come to be within it be limited by having a beginning and end of coming to be? Again, as Parmenides says, what prevents the all, though it be one and ungenerated, from being nevertheless limited, and, to use his words, like to the mass of a sphere on all sides carefully rounded, everywhere equally far from the midst? For fate hath appointed that neither here nor there should it either be greater or smaller. Now, if it has a centre and extremities, it has a limit, though it is ungenerated, since if it be one and a body, as Melissus himself asserts, it has parts of its own as well, and these all alike. For when he says that the all is similar, he does not use the term of similarity to something else. This is just the point that Anaxagoras raises in disproving that the unlimited is similar, i.e., that what is similar to something else, so that being two or more, it would no longer be one, nor yet unlimited. But perhaps he means similar in relation to itself, in other words, that it is composed of similar parts, being all water, or earth, or something else of the kind. For he clearly holds that in this case being would be one. But each of the parts, being a body, is not unlimited, for it is the whole which is unlimited, and therefore they are limited in relation to one another, although they are ungenerated. Further, if being is both eternal and unlimited, how could it be one, being a body? For if it were composed of dissimilar parts, it would be many. Melissus himself contends that it would then be many. But if it is all water, or all earth, or whatever this being is, it would have many parts, as Zeno too attempts to prove of that which is one in this sense. Its parts would then be a manifold, being some of them smaller and less than others, so that in this way it would vary throughout without any body being added to it, or taken away from it. But if it has no body, or width, or length, how could the one be unlimited? Or why should there not be many, nay, innumerable existents of this kind? Further, if there are more existents than one, why should they not be unlimited in size, just as Xenophanes asserts that the depth both of the earth and of the air is unlimited? Empedocles shows that Xenophanes held this view, for, as though certain people urge such views, he makes the criticism that, if this is the nature of earth and air, it is impossible for them ever to meet. If the depths of the earth are unbounded, and ample the ether, as the words that come forth from the lips of mortals unnumbered, empty and meaningless say, they have seen of the whole but a little. Further, if being is one, there is nothing absurd in supposing that it is not similar everywhere. For if the all is water, or fire, or something of that kind, there is no reason why we should not suppose several kinds of this one being, each kind individually similar to itself. For there is no reason why one kind should not be rare and another dense, as long as the rarity does not involve a void. For in the rare there is not a void isolated in particular parts in such a way that of the whole part is dense and part empty. Rarity, then, meaning that the whole is like this. But rarity is produced when the whole is uniformly full, but uniformly less full than in the dense. But suppose being exists, and is ungenerated, and suppose it were granted that for this reason it is unlimited, and that more than one thing cannot be unlimited, and it must therefore be said to be one, and it is impossible for it to be dissimilar. How can he say that the whole is without motion, if the void cannot exist? Now, Melissus declares that being is without motion, if a void does not exist, for everything moves by changing its place. In the first place, then, this does not agree with the opinion of many, which is that a void does exist, yet it is not a body, but is of the nature of the chaos, as Hesiod describes it first coming into being in the birth of things, considering space to be a prime necessity for things which exist. And the void is, as it were, a vessel in which we expect to find an interior space. But even if there is no void, why should being be less likely to move? For Anaxagoras, who devoted his attention to this subject, and for whom it was not enough merely to declare that a void does not exist, declares that things which are in motion, although there is no void. Similarly, Empedocles says that they are ever in motion continually all through the period of aggregation, but that there is no void, for he says that not of the whole can be void, whence then could any be added? While when all has been aggregated into a single form, so as to be one, emptiness there is none, nor aught that is overflowing. For why should not things assume one another's position, and go through a circle of simultaneous movements, one thing taking the place of another, and that the place of something else, and something else the first position? And what is there in what he has said that precludes a movement taking place in things, consisting in a change of form in an object which remains in the same position? What he, like every one else, terms alteration. As, for example, when white turns into black, or bitter into sweet. For the non-existence of a void, and the inability of that which is full to receive any addition, does not at all preclude the possibility of alteration. Thus, neither are all things necessarily eternal, nor is being necessarily unlimited, but many things are unlimited. Nor is it one, nor homogeneous, nor unmoved, whether it be one, or whether it be many. If this is admitted, there would be nothing in what he has said to prevent existence from being either transposed or altered. If being is one, the movement is of the whole, which differs in density and rarity, and alters without the addition or abstraction of any body; while if there is a multiplicity of existence, their movement is due to their mutual mixture and segregation. For it is not likely that the process of mixture is either a placing of elements one above another, or a putting of them together, such as he supposes, by which either they are immediately distinct, or else they appear each distinct from one another, if the layers above one another are successively rubbed away. But they are so arranged in their mixture that any part of that which is mixed comes into such relation to any part of that with which it is mixed, that even the smallest particles would be found not merely placed together but mixed. For since there is no smallest body, every part is mixed with every other part, just as the whole is mixed. De Xenophanes. Chapter 3. Xenophanes declares that if anything is, it cannot possibly have come into being, and he argues this with reference to God. For that which has come into being must necessarily have done so either from that which is similar, or from that which is dissimilar, and neither alternative is possible. For it is no more possible for like to have been begotten by like, than for like to have begotten like. For at any rate, when similars are equal, all the same qualities inhere in each, and in a similar way in their relations to one another. Nor could unlike have come into being from unlike. For if the stronger could come into being from the weaker, or the greater from the less, or the better from the worse, or reversely, worse things from better, then not being could come to be from being, or being from not being, which is impossible. Accordingly, for these reasons, God is eternal. Now if God is supreme over all, Xenophanes declares that it follows that he must be one. For if there were two or more gods, he would no longer be supreme and the best of all, for then each of the many gods would likewise be supreme. For what God and God's power means is that he is supreme and never inferior, and that he possesses supremacy over all. So far then as he is not superior, he is not God. Now, if there were several gods, supposing they were superior to one another in some respects, and inferior in others, they would not be gods. For it is the nature of the divine not to be inferior. But supposing they were equal, they would not possess God's nature, for God must be supreme, whereas that which is equal is neither better nor worse than that to which it is equal. So that if God be, and be of this nature, God is one and one only, for otherwise he could not even do whatsoever he wished. For if there were more gods than one, he could not do so, therefore he is one only. Being one, he is similar in every part, seeing and hearing, and possessing the other senses in every part of him. For otherwise the parts of God would be superior and inferior to one another, which is impossible. Being similar in every part, he is spherical, for he is not of a certain nature in one part, and not in another, but in every part. Being eternal, and one, and similar, and spherical, he is neither unlimited nor limited, for not being is unlimited. For it has neither middle, nor beginning and end, nor any other parts, and such is the nature of the unlimited. But being could not be of the same nature as not being. On the other hand, if things were several, mutual limitation would occur, but the one has no likeness either to not being or to the many, for that which is one has nothing in which it can find a limit. A one, then, of the kind which Xenophanes declares God to be can, he says, be neither moved nor unmoved. For immobility belongs to not being, for nothing else can go into it, nor can it go into anything else; while movement belongs to a plurality, for one body must move into another's place. Now nothing can ever move into not being, for not being is nowhere. On the other hand, if it moved in the way of things changing into one another, then the one would be more than one. For these reasons, motion belongs to a pair of things, or any number more than one, while rest and immobility belong to that which is nothing. But the one is neither still, nor is it moved, for it is similar neither to not being, nor to the many, but being in every respect of this nature, eternal and one, and similar and spherical, God is neither unlimited nor limited, neither at rest nor in motion. Chapter 4. In the first place, then, Xenophanes also, like Melissus, assumes that what comes into being does so from that which already is. Yet why should not that which comes into being do so, not from something either similar or dissimilar, but from not being? Further, God is no more ungenerated than anything else, even if we suppose that all things have come into being from something similar or dissimilar, which is impossible, so that either there is nothing except God, or everything else is also eternal. Further, he assumes that God is supreme, meaning by this that he is most powerful and best. This does not seem to agree with the customary opinion which holds that some gods are in many respects superior to others. It was not, therefore, from accepted opinion that he took this hypothesis about God, which he treats as though it were admitted. It is said that he understands the supremacy of God in the sense that his nature is superior, not in relation to anything else, but in his own disposition; since surely, in relation to something else, there would be nothing to prevent his excelling, not by his own goodness and strength, but owing to the weakness of all others. But no one would wish to say that God is supreme in this latter sense, but rather that he is in himself as excellent as possible, and there is nothing lacking in him of what is good and noble. If this is so, his supremacy would perhaps follow. But even if there are more gods than one, nothing would prevent their being of this nature, all possessing the greatest possible excellence, and being superior to all else, but not to one another. Now there are, it seems, other things besides God, for he says that God is supreme, and he must necessarily be supreme over something. But supposing that he is one, it does not follow that he sees and hears in every part; for if he does not see in one part, he does not see worse in that part, but does not see at all. But perhaps perceiving in every part means that he would possess the highest excellence if he were similar in every part. Further, if this were his nature, why should he be spherical? And why should he have that shape rather than any other, just because he hears in every part, and is supreme in every part? For just as when we say of white lead that it is white in all its parts, we merely mean that the color whiteness is present in every portion of it, why should we not say similarly of God that sight and hearing and supremacy are present in every part, in the sense that whatsoever portion of him one takes will be found to be possessed of these characteristics? But God is not necessarily spherical, for this reason any more than white lead is. Further, how is it possible that, being a body and having magnitude, God can be neither unlimited nor limited? For that is unlimited which, being capable of limitation, has no limit, and limit occurs in magnitude and multitude and any kind of quantity, and therefore any magnitude which has no limit is unlimited. Again, if God is spherical, he must have a limit; for he has extremities if he has a centre within himself, from which they are at the greatest distance. But anything which is spherical has a centre, for that is spherical in which the extremities are equidistant from the centre. Now it is the same thing to say that a body has extremities, and that it has limits. For if not being is unlimited, why should not being also be unlimited? For why should not some identical attributes be assigned to being and to not being? For no one can perceive at this moment what does not exist, while something may exist at this moment without any one's perceiving it; yet both can be the subject of speech and thought. And the non-existent is not white. Either, then, for this reason, existents are all white. This is in order that we may not assign an identical quality to that which exists, and to the non-existent; or else, I think, there is nothing to prevent anything which exists from being not white. And so being would still more easily admit a negative predicate, namely the unlimited, if, as was said just now, a thing is unlimited owing to its not having a limit; and so being, too, is either unlimited or has a limit. But perhaps to attribute unlimitedness to not being is also absurd; for we do not call everything which has not a limit unlimited, just as we should not say that what is not equal is unequal. Again, why should not God, although he be one, yet be limited, though not by anything which is God? But if God is a sole one, then his parts also must be a sole one. Further, it is also absurd that if in fact the many are limited in relation to one another, for this reason the one should not have a limit; for many of the same predicates belong to the many and to the one; being, for instance, is common to them both. It would therefore perhaps be absurd if we were to declare that God does not exist for the reason that the many exist, so that he may not be like them in this respect. Again, though God be one, why should he not be limited and have limits, even as Parmenides says that, being one, he is like to the mass of a sphere, on all sides, carefully rounded, everywhere equally far from the midst. For the limit must be a limit of something, but not necessarily in relation to something else. That which has a limit does not necessarily have it in relation to something else, as when it is limited in relation to the unlimited which comes next to it. But being limited means the possession of extremities, and when a thing has extremities, it need not necessarily have them in relation to something else. Some things, therefore, may happen both to be limited and to adjoin something else, while others may be limited but not in relation to something else. Again, as regards being and not being unmoved, we must say that to suppose that not being is unmoved because being is moved is perhaps just as absurd as the cases of opposition given above. And further, surely one cannot suppose that not moving and unmoved are the same thing, but the former is the negation of moving, like not equal, which can be correctly used even of the non-existent, while unmoved is used of an actual state, as unequal is used, and to express the contrary of moving, that is, being at rest, just as words with the negative prefix are generally used to express contraries. It is therefore quite right to use the term not moving of the non-existent, but being at rest cannot belong to the non-existent. Similarly, unmoved, which means the same thing, cannot belong to it. Yet Xenophanes uses not moving in the sense of being at rest, and says that not being is at rest because it undergoes no change of position. As we said above, it is perhaps absurd, if we attach some predicate to not being, to assert that it does not apply to being, especially if the predicate used is a negation, such as not moving and not changing its position. For, as has been said, it would preclude a number of predicates from being used of existing things. For it would not be true to say that many is not one, since the non-existent also is not one. Furthermore, in some cases, the contrary predicates seem to follow from the mere negations. For example, a thing must be either equal or unequal if it is a multitude or magnitude, and odd or even if it is a number. Similarly, perhaps, being, if it be a body, must be either at rest or in motion. Further, if God and the one do not move, just because the many move by passing into one another, why should not God also move into something else? For he nowhere states that God is one and sole, but what he says is that there is only one God. But even supposing God were one and sole, why should not the parts of God move into one another, and God himself thus resolve? For he will not, like Zeno, declare that such a one is many, for he himself asserts that God is a body, whether he calls it the All or by some other name. For if he were incorporeal, how could he be spherical? Again, it would only be possible for him neither to move nor to be at rest if he were nowhere. But since he is a body, what would prevent this body from moving in the way mentioned? De Gorgia. Chapter 5. Gorgias declares that nothing exists, and if anything exists, it is unknowable. And if it exists and is knowable, yet it cannot be indicated to others. To prove that nothing exists, he collects the statements of others, who in speaking about being seem to assert contrary opinions, some trying to prove that existence is one and not many, others that it is many and not one, and some that existence are ungenerated, others that they have come to be, and draws a two-edged conclusion. For he argues that if anything exists, it must be either one or many, and either be ungenerated or have come to be. If therefore it cannot be either one or many, ungenerated or having come to be, it would be nothing at all. For if anything were, it would be one of these alternatives. That being, then, is neither one nor many, neither ungenerated nor having come to be, he attempts to prove by following partly Melissus and partly Zeno, after first stating his own special proof that it is not possible either to be or not to be. For he says, if not to be is not to be, then not being would be no less than being, for not being is not being, and being is being, so that things no more are than are not. But if not to be is, then he argues, to be its opposite is not. For if not to be is, it follows that to be is not. So that on this showing, he says, nothing could be, unless to be and not to be are the same thing. And if they are the same thing, even so nothing would be. For not being is not, nor yet being, since it is the same as not being. Such, then, is his first argument. Chapter 6. Now it does not at all follow from what he has said that nothing is. For the proof which he and others attempt is thus refuted. If not being is, it either is simply, or else it is in a similar sense, because it is non-existent. But this is not self-evident, nor a necessary deduction. But if there are, as it were, two things, of which one is and the other is not, you can truly say of the former that it is, but not of the latter, because that which is existent, but that which is not non-existent. Why, then, is it not possible either to be or not to be? And why should not both or either be possible? For he says, not to be, if not to be were, as he thinks, something, would be just as much as to be, while at the same time he denies that not to be has any kind of existence. But even if not being is not being, yet it does not follow that not being is in a similar way to being, for the former is not being, while the latter actually is as well. But even if he could say of not being that it is simply, yet how strange it would be to say that not being is. Still, granted that it were so, does it any more follow that everything is not rather than is? For the exact opposite seems then to become the consequent, since if not being is being, and being is being, all things are, for both the things which are and the things which are not are. For it does not necessarily follow that if not being is not. Even if one were to concede the point and allow that not being is and being is not, nevertheless something would be, for the things which are not would be, according to this argument. But if to be and not to be are the same thing, even so it would not follow that nothing is, rather than that something is. For just as he argues that if not being and being are the same thing, being and not being alike are not, therefore nothing is, so, reversing the position, it is equally possible to argue that everything is, for not being is, and being is, therefore everything is. After this argument, Gorgias declares that if anything is, it must either be ungenerated or else have come to be. If it is ungenerated, he adopts the tenet of Melissus that it is unlimited, and declares that the unlimited cannot exist anywhere. It cannot, he argues, exist in itself, or in anything else, for on the latter supposition there would be two unlimiteds, that which is in something else, and the something else in which it is, and being nowhere it is nothing, according to the argument of Zeno about space. Being is not therefore ungenerated, nor again has it come to be, for surely, he argues, nothing could come to be out of either being or not being. For if being were to change, it would no longer be being, just as also if not being were to come to be, it would no longer be not being. Nor again could it come to be save from being. For if not being is not, nothing could come to be out of nothing; while, on the other hand, if not being is, it could not come to be out of not being, for the same reasons for which it could not come to be out of being. So if anything that is, necessarily either is ungenerated or else has come to be, and these are impossibilities, it is impossible for anything to be. Further, if anything is, either one or more things must be; if neither one nor more, nothing is. Nor, he says, can anything move. For if it were to move, it would be no longer in the same condition, but being would be not being, and not being would have come to be. And further, if it moves and is transferred to a different position, being no longer continuous, is divided, and where it is divided, it no longer exists. And so, if it moves in all its parts, it is divided in all its parts, and if this is so, it ceases to exist in all its parts. For where it is divided, he argues, there it lacks being. He uses divided to mean a void, as is written in the so-called arguments of Leucippus. These are the proofs which he employs to show that nothing exists. He next goes on to prove that if anything exists, it is unknowable; for otherwise, he argues, all objects of cognition must exist, and not being, if it really does not exist, could not be cognized either. But were this so, nothing could be false; not even, he says, though one should say that chariots are racing on the sea, for all things would be just the same. For the objects of sight and hearing are for the reason that they are in each case cognized. But if this is not the reason, if just as what we see is not the more because we see it, so also what we think is not the more for that; and were it otherwise, just as in the one case our objects of vision would often be just the same, so in the other our objects of thought would often be just the same. But of which kind the true things are is uncertain, so that even if things are, they would be unknowable by us. But even if they are knowable by us, how, he asks, could any one indicate them to another? For how, he says, could any one communicate by word of mouth that which he has seen? And how could that which has been seen be indicated to a listener if he has not seen it? For just as the sight does not recognize sounds, so the hearing does not hear colors but sounds, and he who speaks, speaks, but does not speak a color or a thing. When, therefore, one has not a thing in the mind, how will he get it there from another person by word or any other token of the thing, except by seeing it, if it is a color, or hearing it, if it is a noise? For he who speaks does not speak a noise at all, or a color, but a word; and so it is not possible to conceive a color, but only to see it, nor a noise, but only to hear it. But even if it is possible to know things, and to express whatever one knows in words, yet how can the hearer have in his mind the same thing as the speaker? For the same thing cannot be present simultaneously in several separate people, for in that case the one would be two. But if, he argues, the same thing could be present in several persons, there is no reason why it should not appear dissimilar to them, if they are not themselves entirely similar, and are not in the same place. For if they were in the same place, they would be one and not two. But it appears that the objects which even one and the same man perceives at the same moment are not all similar, but he perceives different things by hearing and by sight, and differently now and on some former occasion, and so a man can scarcely perceive the same thing as some one else. Thus nothing exists, and if anything could exist, nothing is knowable, and even if anything were knowable, no one could indicate it to another, Firstly, because things are not words, and secondly, because no one can have in his mind the same thing as some one else. This and all his other arguments are concerned with difficulties raised by earlier philosophers, so that in examining their views, these questions have to be discussed. End of chapter 6, and end of On Melissus, Xenophanes, and Gorgias, by Aristotle. Translated by Edward Forster and T. Loveday. Recorded by Geoffrey Edwards. Recording in memory of Mitchell Edwards.